Good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Had a nice day at work? Good. So today, I'll be presenting my senior project that I use. This is a study that I did my senior year, during my senior year at UVI. It's based on public opinions on the significance of Fort Christiansvaern. So the goal, first, before I even do that, let me introduce myself. My name is Akeem McIntosh, obviously. I'm a recent graduate of the University of the Virgin Islands, St Croix campus. I graduated last May in 2016, obviously. I was the student speaker of the class. What else? I'm a intern with the Park Service. I've been an intern with the Park Service and volunteer for the past year, and working with the Park Service, I've had some amazing experiences, met some wonderful people, and learned a lot of things. And those experiences working with the Park Service kind of served as my motivation for selecting this particular project or topic for my senior project. So again, public opinions on the significance of Fort Christiansvaern. So the goal of this project was to show or to determine if a person's regional identity, where they come from, the region or area that they identify themselves with, if that affects the way they they view certain things, if that affects their perceptions and the amount of significance that they would assign to certain objects and buildings and places and so on. So before we could actually determine that, we have to identify what is or define what is regional identity. So a person's regional identity is basically their association with territorial boundaries. So for instance, our regional identity might be the 84 square miles of St Croix, or just the territory of the Virgin Islands on a whole. The institutions, things like their institutions, such as like their beliefs, their value system, their symbols, the flag, coat of arms, and the practices of that particular region. All of this help to contribute to comprise. All of this is what the regional identity is comprised of. So these things are expected to actually influence a person's perceptions and a person's ideas and their ideas of significance of what makes something significant. For instance, if you were to see a fort in France versus this fort, you would think very differently, or someone from France might think differently of our fort here versus a fort in France because of different things such as size, location, and stuff and things like that. So that's basically what I was hoping to show with this particular project. So Fort Christiansvaern, the main visitors to Fort Christiansvaern are primarily visitors from here in the Virgin Islands. We also have Danes who come from, obviously, Denmark, and people from the US mainland. Now, the US mainland was just a word that we use to differentiate between Virgin Islanders and people from the States, specifically because you have to be specific when you're selecting your participants. The reason I selected these three groups were because of the shared history between these three groups. All three groups have occupied the island at some point in history. The Danes obviously came before the Americans, and then the Americans took over in 1917. But during the different administrations, the Virgin Islanders have witnessed the changes that have taken place as the different administrations reigned over the islands. So each of them witnessed the same history, but from a different perspective. So that was actually the goal, to show that even though they're all on the same island, they've all spent time on the same island, the fact that they have different backgrounds, they come from different areas and might identify with different regions, that might influence their thinking about the fort. Actually, in my research, I found that there might not be much of a difference in visitors' opinions of like visiting parks and sites and so on. But because of the history that's associated with this particular park, the fort in particular, I figured that there should be some effect of regional identity on public opinions. So the regional identity is expected to affect three things. It's actually expected to the three variables that I will be focusing on, or I focused on in this project, was historical significance, historical appreciation, and historical knowledge gained. So does a person's regional identity affect the amount of historical significance that they assign to the fort? Does it affect how much appreciation they have for the fort? And does it affect how much knowledge they gain as a result of the fort? In other words, do they focus on, is their focus on certain things? Is their focus on the history of slavery? Is their focus on Alexander Hamilton? Is their focus on the location? And how do they differ based on where they come from? So to identify or to give a little context to the variables, historical significance is actually the importance to history or culture of a community. It's generally associated with like physical characteristics, historical events, and significant people in the history that's associated with a particular place or building. So that's basically what historical significance can be identified as. Historical appreciation, it was kind of difficult to differentiate between historical significance and appreciation because they're so similar. But appreciation is identified in this project as a person's personal value to like events and occurrences in history. So whereas significance might be the greater picture, the appreciation would be what it means to this particular individual. So what does this mean to you as an individual versus what does this mean to the overall history in general? Historical knowledge gained, it's actually an interpretation of meaningful human actions, practices to understand the effects of these human actions. So for instance, we have the fort, and the fort at different points in time have served different roles. In the very beginning, it served as a means of protection to protect the channel here in front here by between the waterfront and Protestant Quay, or as we now know it today, Hotel on the Quay. In later years, it served as a prison, and it also served as like the headquarters of the police station. It served as a police station. It also served as a courthouse. So over the course of the years, it has served different roles, and this is all because of different needs that humans have had for that particular building. So now, historical knowledge is basically the understanding of those different changes that have taken place as a result of, I guess, human needs. So the instrument or the object used to measure these variables was a survey. The survey was comprised of a series of questions that were that were adopted and adapted from the National Park Service pool of known questions. Who knew that there was a pool of known questions? But after some digging, I was able to find a list of some questions that actually seemed very appropriate and ideal for this particular project. Though they required a little bit of tweaking, it served the purpose that I needed. The survey was comprised of each variable had three quantitative questions as well as one qualitative question. So the quantitative questions were scored on a Likert scale of 1 to 5 overall, with each variable getting an overall score between 3 and 15, 3 being the lowest, 15 being the highest, meaning when I say a Likert scale, I'm referring to strongly agree, neutral, strongly disagree, or disagree. So if a person scores 15 for historical significance, then that would mean that this person strongly agrees that the fort is historically significant, versus if they were to score a 3 for historical significance, then that would mean that this person doesn't think the fort is very significant. Now, the qualitative aspect of the survey adds more substance to the numbers. So whereas the numbers would just give you an idea of how they feel towards the fort, the qualitative questions allow them an opportunity to provide short answers and elaborate on their feelings of the fort. So for instance, they might be able to say why they feel that this fort is less significant, or why is this aspect of the fort, what is the most significant aspect of the fort, what is the most significant aspect that you would want to share with your family and your friends, and things like that. So after the results, now after calculating the results, we actually found that the Virgin Islanders, the group furthest to your left, furthest to the left would be the US Virgin Islanders. In the center, we have the US mainlanders, or the Americans, US mainlanders, and we have the Danes all the way to the right. So the results for historical significance were somewhat expected, yet somewhat surprising. We actually have the US Virgin Islanders with the highest level of historical significance assigned. So in other words, that means that the US Virgin Islanders consider the fort to be most significant out of the 3 groups. On the other hand, we have the Danes with the second most significance assigned, and the Americans with the least amount of significance assigned. Now, though the Danes have assigned more significance to the fort, you can see that the 2 bars kind of overlap one another. So that shows that there isn't a significant difference between the 2. So the historical significance of Fort Christiansvaern to the Danes and the Americans are not very different. Now, when you look at the qualitative questions, it kind of makes sense, because the Danes in particular, some of them didn't know the history of the fort in its entirety, nor did they know that the fort was used as a prison to hold slaves and to hold people who committed crimes. Some of them, when they actually came to the fort and they went into the dungeons, they were kind of, how can I say, appalled that some of their answers participated in things like in such things. So that might, and some of them felt that the information that was shared in the fort focused too much on the history of slavery. So that might have taken away from their level of historical significance. Of course, we have the Virgin Islanders with the highest level of significance because they're the most directly connected to the fort, whereas the Americans, most of the Americans that visited the fort were practically on vacation. So their mindset may not have been on the significance of the fort. In terms of appreciation, we have generally the same result for the Virgin Islanders, of course. The Virgin Islanders have the highest level of historical appreciation. Again, that was to be expected. The Americans, on the other hand, have more historical appreciation for the fort than the Danes. Now, when you look at the responses that were provided in the qualitative aspect of the survey, you realize that the Americans were focused. They reported themes primarily revolving around the location of the fort, how beautiful the fort is, and how beautiful the environment of the environment is. Also, a lot of them didn't know that Alexander Hamilton had history here in the Virgin Islands, on St Croix in particular. So they were very intrigued about that and appreciated learning that information. So I would say that contributes to their higher level of historical significance versus the Danes, who once again showed a bit of, I guess you could say, expressed a bit of shame in the history of the fort and their association with the history of the fort. So that might contribute to why they have a lower level of historical appreciation for the fort than the other 2 groups. For historical knowledge gained, again, we have the Virgin Islanders with the highest level of historical knowledge gained. I found this to be very surprising because growing up in the Virgin Islands, I know that we have been exposed to the fort from knee-high, you know, but then as a child going to the fort, you're not really focused on the information being learned or the information being shared. You're just excited to get out of the classroom. So so now, and another thing that I didn't mention is that everyone that I surveyed was 18 and older. If I was to survey anyone younger than 18, then I would have to get special permission from parents. And the surveys were also conducted off-site, because to get permission to do the surveys on-site was a very lengthy procedure. So again, the Virgin Islanders who were surveyed, they were all over 18 years old. So being exposed to the fort at such a young age, you would expect or anticipate that they would have already known this information. So going to the fort now and being surveyed now, they would report, you wouldn't expect them to report any newer information being gained or any more knowledge being gained as it pertains to the fort. But the results actually proved otherwise. By visiting the fort, they're learning more or reporting higher levels of knowledge gained than actually expected. The U.S. mainlanders, they surprised me very much so, because they're the least, I guess you could say they're the least connected, because they came in years after the fort was already built, because the fort was built in, I think it was completed in the mid 1700s. 1749. It was completed in 1749, which was over 200 years before the transfer. So the Americans would not have had much reason to be connected or interested in the fort, especially the fact that most of them are on vacation. They're, like I said before, they're focused primarily on enjoying the breeze, looking at the trees and the sea, the waves, and enjoying the beauty of the fort and how well preserved it is. So their interest was not so much on the history of the fort, but the beauty of the location and all of these other aesthetics, I would say that contributes to why they reported such low levels of historical knowledge gained. The Danes, once again, reported the second highest level of historical knowledge gain. So that shows that there were some things that they didn't know, or a lot of things that they didn't know about the Virgin Islands or the fort in particular. Because if they did, then they might have been lower with the Americans. Now, for the qualitative results, each variable, historical significance, historical appreciation, and historical knowledge gained, each variable had its own qualitative question. In other words, a short answer question. So most of the groups, in order to calculate the results for the qualitative questions, we had to read through each response and then categorize them by themes. So the U.S. mainlanders, their responses were primarily in themes pertaining to the location of the fort, its general history, and its history of slavery, whereas the Danes responded pertaining to the history of slavery, the history of the fort, and its preservation. I mean, I was kind of expecting the history, for them to respond pertaining to the preservation of the fort, because the fort is such an old building and it's so well preserved. It's one of the best examples of the history of the Caribbean that's in such good condition throughout the Caribbean today. So that's kind of to be expected. The U.S. Virgin Islanders, on the other hand, they reported primarily on the history of slavery and the history of the fort. Now, if you just watch the results, you could see that there are some things that stand out for everyone, but then there are some things that stand out more so for some than others. For instance, the Danes reported the preservation, whereas the Americans focus primarily on the location. And once again, these things show that there is some difference in their thinking while visiting the fort. For historical appreciation, the question was asked, after visiting the fort, what aspect of the fort's history or the fort's story or history might you share with family and friends? And they were asked to be specific. The themes revolve primarily around Alexander Hamilton. Most Americans, once again, had no idea that Alexander Hamilton spent any time on this island. Once again, and Alexander Hamilton actually left the island in 1774. Am I right? 1774, and then they drafted the Declaration of Independence in what, 1776. So that shows that most of his education came from St Croix, and that shows that St Croix played a major role in the development of America as we know it today. So most people visiting the fort had no clue, had no idea that one of the forefathers of America spent time here and got his education here on St. Croix. So that was one of the main things that they reported on. They also reported on the location of the fort, the history of the fort, and its history of slavery. The Danes, on the other hand, they were more inclined to share the Danish history of the fort with their family and friends. And again, that's to be expected considering it's a Danish fort and they're Danish. The U.S. Virgin Islanders, they reported levels of history. They reported themes of pertaining to the history of the fort and the history of slavery. And it's, again, anything pertaining to the Virgin Islanders is kind of to be, well, when you look at the themes that are being reported recurringly in such a recurring fashion, it's not surprising because they're reporting the history of slavery, and most of the Virgin Islanders are actually descendants of those who were enslaved. So it's not surprising, and again, it just helps to prove the point that where you come from, how you identify yourself, kind of helps to influence the way you think about certain things. Even though, like I said, even though they all spent some time on this island, the fact that the Danes identify with Denmark, the Virgin Islanders identify with these islands, the Americans identify with America. You know, that all show that all these things help to influence the way they think about different things, particularly in this example, the fort. For historical knowledge gain, the question that was asked was, what was the most important new information that you learned about Fort Christiansvaern? And once again, the themes are the same. The Americans reported on, or the U.S. mainlanders, they reported on Alexander Hamilton and the history of the fort's history of slavery. The Danes focused primarily on the history of slavery, its preservation, and the history of the fort, the Danish history of the fort to be exact. And the Virgin Islanders identified themes related to the history, this history of slavery and the general history of the fort. So after reviewing the quantitative evidence and the qualitative evidence, there's enough evidence to show that there is an effect, a significant or regional identity significantly affects historical significance, historical appreciation, and historical knowledge gained. So again, that just shows that where you come from influences the way you think about things. And it's clear that these things are affected by the way our thinking is affected by the way we grow up, the things that we see growing up, the places that we go, and the things that we associate with. So again, if you have a fort in France, it's very different from a fort in the Caribbean, and the history of the fort in France would be very different from the history of the fort in the Caribbean. So now someone coming from France who has seen these forts all of their life, and not only seeing forts all their lives, but seeing so many different examples of forts, they would have a very different perspective, or you would expect that they would have a very different perspective from someone who lives on St. Croix and has only seen 2 forts for their entire life. So for if I were to continue working on this project or further this study, some things I would want to consider would be race, because race might have been, what's the word I'm looking for, a confounding factor in this study. In other words, it may have affected the results more than it was originally considered to have been an effect. Because again, the fort is associated with slavery, and slavery is associated with that, white and black, or that racial divide. So that may have affected the opinions of the fort. Education level might be another thing to consider, because some people might not have been educated about different things because of their education level. Some people might not have known of the history of the fort because of their education level, and that may have been another effect, another variable that might have affected the results of the study. The age of the participants as well, because older folks might look at some things differently from younger folks. And another very important factor was standardized tours. In my study, I had several different tour guides, and each tour guide represented or shared the information differently. Some may have been enthusiastic, some may have been very nonchalant. And the way in which someone presents something to you might make a big difference in how you think about something or how you feel about something. So those things, standardized tours may be a very important aspect of the study that I would need to include if I were to continue or further this study. Some recommendations to improve visitor experience. I don't know if I might be like stepping over my stepping out of place with this one, but hey, one thing for sure I think the park would really benefit or can do to improve visitor experience is to have more tour guides or interpretive rangers on staff. That definitely would make a big difference, because sometimes you have visitors who come to the fort and there might not be anyone to share, to inform them or to give them the extra information. The knowledge that they gain is limited to the waysides, and it's not the same. Reading history is not the same as someone telling you a story and making the story. And the history of the fort is actually an epic, and if it's told correctly, it can really capture an audience or capture someone's attention. But if there aren't any tour guides to share that information, I mean, Benito does a great job, but he is only one person and he can't be everywhere at the same time. Wow. So I think having more tour guides or more interpretive rangers might be a great thing that might help to improve the visitor experience at Fort Christiansvaern. In terms of community events, I think some more community events in the fort might help to attract more people more visitors to the fort, and also make the community feel more connected to the fort, because right now we have things like jazz in the park, and movies at the park, but those things are actually outside of the fort, and it kind of takes the attention away from the fort. Not only that, but it doesn't help to inform the community of the history of the fort. And I think we could really do a better job of engaging the community of the history of the fort. So things like storytelling and live reenactments. I can't remember, the Landmark Society, they actually do like a walkthrough where they would show how like Africans would come off of the boat and walk over to this courtyard to then go on the action block and things like that. I mean, there are a lot of people who don't know the history and don't know the procedure that the Africans went through during slavery. And again, considering that the Virgin Islands is predominantly African descendants, I think they might benefit from something like that, and they would probably appreciate it more and want to come to visit the fort even more after learning that history. or seeing something like that happening. So more community events might be a good idea. And for sure, a greater variety of the history in the fort. If you ask me, the history of the, I know that as a national park, it has to focus on the history of the fort, but I think St. Croix actually, I've been working on several projects with the Park Service, and the projects have given me an opportunity to delve deeper into the history of the Virgin Islands. We actually did a timeline, me and my counterpart, my colleague, Ms. Keita Westergaard. Can you please stand? Together we worked on a 357-year timeline that compares the history of Denmark, the Virgin Islands, and America. Now, this shows that when one thing happened in one country, how did it affect the other country? So when Denmark was at war, what was going on in the Virgin Islands? When when America was going through the Great Depression, how was the Virgin Islands affected? So these are the kind of comparisons that we were trying to show. But just in preparing that timeline, I got the opportunity to learn so much of the history. And again, the history of the Virgin Islands, St. Croix in particular, is quite epic. And I think that visitors would really appreciate learning more about the history of the island as well as the history of the fort. I would like to share some acknowledgements. My 3 advisors, I had 3 advisors. I was actually supposed to have 2 for my project, for my class, but I actually ended up with 3. I'm so fortunate. My professors, Dr. Aletha Bauman, she's not here. Another professor served as my second reader, Mr. Michael Prosper, and my office mother, I should say, Zandy, please stand. She was very, very instrumental in helping me to put this project together. Oh, and Benito Vegas. He did a few tours for me. Celeste Foy, she did a tour for me. Miss Nina York also did a tour for me. Bravo Tours, and Twin City Coffee House, that was actually the survey location. So after the tours were done in the fort, the participants were then led over to Twin City Coffee House, where they then filled out the survey. And that concludes my presentation.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Thank you for coming. So my name is Nicole Besemer. I am a seasonal biological science technician here at Buck Island Reef National Monument. I have been here for about 4 months now. And previous to that, I was working at Biscayne National Park, finishing my master's research at the University of Miami. So let's get started. So, lionfish. The reason we're all here, at least the reason Zandy put me up on this podium. The invasive lionfish are native to the Indo-Pacific Oceans, and they were introduced to the Caribbean waters by humans. It is the first non-native fish to completely settle within these waters. Their initial introduction is thought to have occurred during Hurricane Andrew in 1992, when at least 6 lionfish escaped from a broken beachside aquarium near Biscayne Bay. However, this documentation of a lionfish, there was actually documentation of a lionfish being caught north of Miami in 1985. It is more likely that the initial introduction came from just the private aquarium trade. The fish outgrew the aquariums and they thought they were doing a benefit by releasing them back into the ocean, but now we have what is known as the lionfish invasion. You can see here with the animation that they were able to spread quite rapidly. And just as sort of an overall depiction, this is an 18-year time period that they were able to completely spread throughout the Caribbean and North Atlantic. So they are able to do this because of a few specific life history traits. They've reached sexual maturity really early on, at about 1 year, and they can reproduce year-round, several times per month. One individual can produce about 2 million eggs per year, and they have a very high thermal tolerance, so they can thrive in a lot of different temperatures. They also have no natural predators here in these oceans, which is basically what has given them the ability to outbreed, outcompete, and outlive any other fish on these reefs. They have made detrimental, they have caused detrimental population, why can I say this? Basically, they affect these really commercially important fish for us, grouper, snapper. They can eat prey half the size of their own body, and their stomachs can expand 30 times the normal size. So thanks to climate change, temperatures are increasing, and as I mentioned before, their thermal tolerance is basically allowing their range to expand. Even larger than this picture shows. The top sort of red area of this picture is about the Carolinas. They are now being found as far north as Nova Scotia. They cover a vast geographic range and variety of habitats. And with this, it has become pretty apparent that complete eradication is highly unlikely. So managers have realized that because of this range, we need to start focusing on the most critical habitats and come up with actions, management actions to reduce the number of lionfish at high priority sites to preserve and conserve our natural resources. So two areas that are located in the park, the two parks that I'm about to talk about, are juvenile fish habitats. These are such as mangrove forests, as well as seagrass beds, and coral reefs are important because they can cause the most detrimental grazing to these areas, as it's where most of the juvenile fish are living that they feed on. And marine protected areas, no take zones, as they are actually the refuges for the marine species and have been put into place to promote growth and population expansion of the native fish populations. So two different strategies are being used at the two different parks. And I'm going to start with the park where I first gained my lionfish background, Biscayne National Park in Miami, Florida. But I will give you a quick overview of the location so you can understand what these managers are working with. So Biscayne National Park is one of 4 national park entities located in South Florida. They are accompanied by Big Cypress Natural Preserve, as well as the fairly well-known Everglades National Park, and out to the west of the Keys, Dry Tortugas National Park. And Biscayne was actually a national monument first, and it became Biscayne National Park in 1980. So the area covered is about 173,000 acres. Just to put that into perspective for you, Buck Island National Monument is 19,000 acres. So it's a pretty large area that we're working with, and it's 95% water. Over 500 species of fish are able to thrive here, and this is because of the 4 main ecosystems that we have. Mangrove forest along our coastline. We have Biscayne Bay. We then have the northernmost islands of the Florida Keys. The Keys do actually start a little bit north of where most people consider the Florida Keys. And we also have the beginning of the 3rd largest coral reef in the world. So what is Biscayne National Park doing about it? Well, since the lionfish became a problem, they have actively removed 6,292 individual lionfish captures since 2010. This is mostly attested to the Biscayne National Park Management Plan that was created in 2008. I was able to come on board with the program when I began my master's degree at the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science. No, that's a mouthful, so we're going to call it RASMUS from now on. So RASMUS created the Masters of Professional Science program as a way to, it's basically an accelerated program to place students directly into the workforce and gain valuable skills that they would not have gotten otherwise. So in 2011, the program held a meeting to reach out to these local environmental entities, and with the hope to create a partnership to facilitate the internship aspect of the program. The biologist at Biscayne, Vanessa McDonough, had just received funding to work on the lionfish problem, and she thought it would be a great way to bring students into the park as well as increase the available resources or increase available support to actually perform the daily tasks of the management plan. This partnership has now been going on for 5 years and was recently renewed for another 5 years. So a little bit in the day of the life of a lionfish intern. There are 2 interns that generally come on board around June and stay through December. Our work schedule is generally 6 dives a day, 4 days a week, and we are able to utilize a fleet of 5 resource management boats to perform the removals and research. My project with the park builds upon past studies that together increase some of the management practices. So some of these other projects include outreach and interpretation to the local community, as well as recolonization rates at the high priority sites throughout the park. These projects not only help to improve the management practices, but they really increase public awareness of the problem and involvement in the control. So with that, I will begin to tell you about what I was able to contribute to the park, which is fitting a growth curve to the invasive lionfish population in Biscayne National Park and surrounding barrier islands, excuse me. So a growth curve is a relationship between length and age. So similar to the way that you can cut down a tree, count the rings to see how old it is, while the lionfish otoliths, which is part of their ear bone, can actually represent age the same way. So these are 2 pictures of an otolith, and I don't want to get too sciencey on you, but this is a cross section of the ear bone. From the top picture, this small center is actually the core, so basically the beginning of it. The small fine scale lines that you see are actually representation of the juvenile stage of the fish, and from there out the larger bands become the adult years. It's a little bit hard to tell in the top picture, but you can see down here that they're not easy to find. It takes a lot of like squinting your eyes and really figuring out what's there, but we were able to denote 3+ years of growth on that otolith down below. So this length and age growth curve is important because we're able to specifically age fish in the high priority areas. And it's important to know if we're working with these large reproducing adults or if we're working with the juvenile recruits. There's been no previously published aging work of lionfish done in the Florida region, so we hope that this will bring new light to the continuing research. Basically, these scientists and managers will be able to use the growth curve to determine the age of the fish they just caught and be able to sort of directly apply that right away to what they're doing instead of having to actually look at the otoliths themselves. I personally have looked at about 250 plus otoliths, as well as my advisor, and there are other interns that are continuing the project to create a more comprehensive report after this. I was sort of the pilot study of having master's students do it. So, much like Biscayne, Buck Island National Monument has a lionfish problem too. The first lionfish records from the U.S. Virgin Islands were from a diver who saw and photographed several individuals at 2 sites on north shore of St Croix in about June of 2008. So in 2013, Stephanie Green and Lad Atkins came down here to work with the park and perform a study that would basically estimate the densities of lionfish within the monument, as well as evaluate the ability of volunteer divers to maintain the population's behold threshold levels. And what I mean by this is basically control the amount of lionfish to a population where our reefs and native fish species can still survive. Okay, there we go. So these removal studies taking place in actually 2 different areas, on St Croix, as pictured, but also as well as utilizing partners in South Florida who perform this in the Keys using the same method. The 2 regions allowed us to compare whether the patterns and trends are the same in different areas, and so that we can provide information that is generally relevant across the region on how to best control lionfish and their impacts. Okay, so what they did find was that lionfish recolonize on patch reefs at much greater rates than they do on fringing reef and hard bottom sites, which are types of coral reefs found within the National Monument. And this finding was actually able to bring us to our next study coming up here in the future, starting in January and February. So University of the Virgin Islands scientists Rick Nemeth and Bernard Castillo plan to utilize our acoustic array system to track how lionfish move between these patch reef structures. This will include fine-scale movements within a VPS, or basically a tightly clustered group of receivers that are actually able to triangulate a specific location that a transmitter or tag that we are going to put into the lionfish. And Zandy has a heart attack every time we talk about this, but we we will be actually catching them, inserting the tag, and releasing them back into the ocean so that we're able to see where they move and see how they utilize the patch reef system on the South Fore Reef. They'll also be able to do this on a large scale aspect with utilizing the receivers in and around the monument to see how they're using the protected area as a whole. So it is with these studies that we will be able to develop our own lionfish response plan specific to Buck Island Reef National Monument. So these are just two examples of what the National Park Service is doing, but with research, education, and outreach, we can strive to limit their population and growth and mitigate impacts to our beautiful and priceless natural resources that we have here. Thank you.